You are standing on a wooden deck no wider than a London alley. 6 paces port to starboard, 20 paces bow to stern. Beneath your feet, a single layer of oak planking, and beneath that, the Atlantic Ocean. There is no quarterdeck worth the name, no great cabin, no surgeon's berth, no carpenter's walk, no magazine below an iron-plated door. There is a tiller in your hand, a single mast above you, and 60 square yards of canvas pulling so hard against the wind that the leeward rail dips to within inches of the sea. You have 75 men aboard a vessel designed for 12. There are no gun ports. Your 4 cannons sit on the open deck, lashed between the rails, their muzzles aimed at nothing because there is no room to traverse them. Your crew sleeps in shifts on the same planks where they eat, fight, and bleed. The privy is a plank hung over the bow. The galley is a brick box amidships where a fire is sometimes, not always, permitted. And this is the ship that made the golden age of piracy possible. Not the towering galleon of Hollywood, not the 100-gun ship of the line, not the black-hulled frigate with the skeleton figurehead and a crew of spectral thousands. A sloop, 40 to 60 feet of shallow draft, single-masted, fore and aft rigged fury, the fastest thing on the Caribbean Sea. And if you want to understand how a generation of pirates terrorized the Atlantic world for 20 years, you need to understand this ship first. Because the Golden Age was not built on firepower, it was built on speed. Subscribe now and join me. Because the story of the sloop is the story the movies never tell you. To understand the sloop, you need to understand the Caribbean in the late 17th century. Not as a stage for adventure, but as an industrial zone. By the 1670s, the English colonies of Bermuda and Jamaica had developed a local shipbuilding tradition that owed very little to the royal dockyards of England. Bermuda cedar, Juniperus bermudiana, was light, rot-resistant, and plentiful. Jamaican shipwrights worked with mahogany and tropical hardwoods that European builders had never touched. And the product of both traditions was a vessel shaped not by naval architecture textbooks, but by the specific demands of Caribbean waters. Those demands were simple. You needed a ship that could navigate the shallow, reef-strewn channels between the Bahamas. You needed a ship that could outrun a Spanish guarda-costa in a light breeze. You needed a ship that could be hauled onto a beach, scraped clean of weed and barnacles, and refloated in a single tide. And you needed a ship that one man, or a very small crew, could handle in a squall. The Bermuda sloop answered every one of these demands. She was typically 40 to 60 feet on the waterline, some as short as 35, a few as long as 75. She drew as little as 4 or 5 feet of water, which meant she could ghost across reef flats where a frigate would tear her keel out. She carried a single mast, sometimes fitted with a topmast for additional canvas, rigged fore and aft with a large gaff mainsail, a jib, and sometimes a staysail or flying jib. This rig, unlike the square rig of a ship or a brig, allowed her to sail much closer to the wind, a critical advantage when chasing or fleeing, and she was fast. Contemporary accounts consistently describe Bermuda sloops making 10 to 12 knots in favorable conditions, speeds that few square-rigged vessels of any size could match. Captain Charles Johnson, writing in 1724, called the sloop the ablest sailor in the American seas. That assessment is confirmed by Admiralty reports from governors in Jamaica, Bermuda, and the Bahamas throughout the 1710s and 1720s, all of whom complained that they had no vessel in their station capable of catching a pirate sloop. The design was not static. By the early 1700s, Jamaican shipyards had begun producing what the records called Jamaica sloops, slightly beamier than the Bermuda type, with a broader transom stern and sometimes a shallow hold for cargo. Bermuda builders, meanwhile, kept refining for speed, producing the sharp-bowed, narrow-beamed vessels that would eventually influence the Baltimore clipper designs of the late 18th century. But the critical point is this. By 1715, when the War of the Spanish Succession ended and thousands of unemployed privateers flooded into Nassau and the Caribbean, The sloop was already the dominant small vessel of the region. It was cheap. It was available. Any competent carpenter could repair it. And it was the fastest thing afloat. The pirates did not invent the sloop. They inherited it. The roll call of famous pirate vessels is, overwhelmingly, a roll call of sloops. Start with Benjamin Hornigold, the founding figure of the Nassau Pirate Republic. In 1713 and 1714, Hornigold operated from a series of small sloops and periaguas, dugout canoes with plank sides, raiding Spanish shipping in the Straits of Florida. His early fleet was laughable by naval standards, open boats with a dozen men and a few muskets. But the sloops were fast enough to catch merchantmen and shallow enough to escape into the labyrinth of the Bahamas. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, began his pirate career aboard Hornigold's sloop. When Teach set out on his own in 1716, his first independent command was a sloop. It was only later, after capturing the French slave ship La Concorde and converting her into the 40-gun Queen Anne's Revenge, that Teach moved to a larger vessel. But even then, he kept sloops in his squadron. The Adventure, an 8-gun sloop commanded by Israel Hands, served as his tender and scout. When the Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground at Beaufort Inlet in June 1718, Teach transferred to the Adventure, back to a sloop, and continued operating. Stade de Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, bought a sloop outright. His Revenge was a 10-gun sloop, approximately 60 feet long, which he purchased and fitted out in Barbados in 1717. The fact that a man with no maritime experience chose a sloop for his pirate enterprise tells you something about the vessel's reputation. Even a gentleman planter knew that a sloop was what a pirate needed. Charles Vane operated sloops almost exclusively. His Ranger, not to be confused with the later vessel of the same name in Bartholomew Roberts' fleet, was a 12-gun sloop from which he terrorized the Carolina coast and the Windward Passage in 1718. When Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in July 1718 with the King's pardon, Vane famously escaped the harbour in his sloop, setting fire to a prize vessel to cover his retreat. Because the sloop was fast enough and shallow enough to slip out through a channel the Navy's frigates could not follow. Calico Jack Rackham sailed sloops. His vessel, sometimes called the William, sometimes simply Rackham's sloop, was a small, fast craft of perhaps 45 feet. It was aboard this sloop that Anne Bonny and Mary Red served. And it was this sloop that Jonathan Barnett captured in October 1720, off the western tip of Jamaica, with most of the crew too drunk to fight. And Samuel Bellamy, Black Sam, began in sloops before he took the wider. The Mary Ann, a sloop he used in his early Florida wrecking operations, was his first command. He graduated to the Sultana, a larger vessel, before finally capturing the slave ship Wider Galley, but even then, the Mary Ann remained in his squadron. The pattern is unmistakable. Pirates started in sloops. They raided in sloops. When they captured larger vessels, they kept sloops as tenders, scouts, and escape craft. The sloop was the foundation of every pirate fleet in the Golden Age. Why was the sloop so effective as a pirate vessel? The answer comes down to 4 tactical advantages that no other ship type could match simultaneously. First, speed. A sloop under optimal conditions could make 10 to 12 knots. The average West Indian merchantman, a full-bodied, square-rigged brigantine or bark, made perhaps 5 to 7 knots. A Royal Navy frigate could make 8 or 9. In a stern chase, the sloop simply ran away. In a pursuit, she closed the distance before her prey could react. Second, weatherliness. The fore and aft rig allowed the sloop to sail within 4 or 5 points of the wind, roughly 45 to 55 degrees off the true wind direction. A square-rigged vessel could rarely manage better than 6 or 7 points. This meant that in a chase to windward, the sloop gained ground on every tack. A merchantman trying to beat up wind to escape a pirate sloop was doomed before she started. Third, shallow draft. A sloop drawing 5 feet of water could navigate channels, sandbars, and reef passages that were impassable to a frigate drawing 14 or 16 feet. This made the sloop effectively uncatchable in the Bahamas, the Florida Keys, the Outer Banks, the shoals of the Carolinas, and the mangrove coasts of Cuba and Hispaniola. The pirates knew these waters. The Navy did not, and the sloop was the only vessel that could exploit that knowledge. Fourth, crew economy. A sloop could be sailed by 8 to 12 men. A pirate sloop on a raiding cruise might carry 60 to 80, far more than needed for sailing, but sufficient for a boarding action. This meant that the pirates could put an overwhelming boarding party onto a merchantman while still leaving a competent sailing crew aboard their own vessel. By contrast, a frigate needed a crew of 200 just to function and could spare relatively few for boarding. But pirates did not simply use sloops as they found them. They adapted them. The most common modification was the addition of guns. A commercial sloop might carry no armament at all, or perhaps a pair of swivel guns. Pirates added 4, 6, 8, sometimes 12 cannons, cutting gun ports in the hull sides, or simply lashing the guns to the deck rails. These were typically 4-pounders or 6-pounders, small by naval standards, but more than sufficient to intimidate a merchant crew and devastating at close range. Pirates also modified the rig. Some added a bowsprit and flying jib for additional speed. Others stepped a small mizzen mast aft, converting the sloop into a ketch or brigantine rig for better balance with the added weight of guns and crew. Sweeps, long oars, were standard equipment, allowing the sloop to be rowed in calms when a square-rigged pursuer was becalmed and helpless, and they careened constantly. A sloop's speed depended entirely on her clean bottom. Marine growth, weed, barnacles, teredo worms could reduce a vessel's speed by 2 or 3 knots within months. Pirates beached their sloops regularly in sheltered coves, scraped the hull, and applied fresh tallow or a mixture of tar and sulfur. This maintenance ritual, unglamorous, back-breaking work, was as important to pirate operations as any battle. The Royal Navy understood the sloop problem perfectly. Governor Woodes Rogers wrote to the Admiralty in 1718 that the pirates' sloops were so well adapted to these seas that no ship on his station could catch them. The Navy's response, over time, was to commission its own sloops, HMS Flamborough, HMS Shark, HMS Happy Return, and to assign them specifically to anti-piracy patrol. But even Navy sloops, crewed by pressed men and bound by regulations about where they could and could not go, struggled to match the pirates' intimate knowledge of local waters and willingness to take risks. Here is what Hollywood wants you to believe. Pirates sailed enormous black ships with 3 masts, 100 guns, and a crew of several hundred desperados. The Black Pearl, the Flying Dutchman, the Queen Anne's Revenge as reimagined for the screen, a floating fortress of supernatural dread. Here is what the historical record actually shows. Of the roughly 200 to 300 documented pirate vessels operating in the Atlantic between 1714 and 1726, the overwhelming majority were sloops. Marcus Rediker, in Villains of All Nations, estimates that sloops accounted for over half of all pirate vessels in the period. David Cordingley, in Under the Black Flag, reaches a similar conclusion. Robert Ritchie's analysis of Admiralty records confirms the pattern. The typical pirate vessel was 40 to 60 feet long, carried 4 to 12 guns, and sailed with a crew of 25 to 75 men. The famous exceptions, Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge, Bartholomew Roberts' Royal Fortune, Sam Bellamy's Wider Galley, were precisely that, exceptions. And even these were not the towering galleons of the popular imagination. The Queen Anne's Revenge was a 200-ton frigate-built vessel, large for a pirate, but small by naval standards. The Wider was a 300-ton galley, a fast, purpose-built slaving vessel, not a warship. The Royal Fortune was a 40-gun frigate, impressive but hardly a first rate, and every one of these pirates kept sloops alongside their larger vessels. Blackbeard had the Adventure. Roberts had the Ranger and the Little Ranger. Bellamy had the Mary Ann. The large ship was the flagship, the statement of power, the floating treasury, the gun platform for pitched battle. But the sloop was the workhorse. There is a reason for the myth, of course. Large ships are more cinematic. They fill a screen. They look like power. A sloop, a narrow, low-slung boat with a single mast, does not look like a vessel of terror. It looks like a fishing boat. But that was precisely the point. The sloop's greatest tactical advantage was that it did not look dangerous until it was too late. A merchant captain spotting a single-masted vessel on the horizon had no reason for alarm until the sloop ran up a black flag at a quarter-mile and fired a shot across his bow. By then, there was no escape. The sloop was already faster, already closer to the wind, already crewed with 70 desperate men with cutlasses and pistols. The sloop did not need to look terrifying. It only needed to be there. To its credit, the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise got one thing half right. In The Curse of the Black Pearl, when Captain Jack Sparrow needs to steal a ship, the vessel he chooses is the HMS Interceptor, described in the film as the fastest ship in the Caribbean. And the Interceptor, as depicted on screen, is a brig, a two-masted, square-rigged vessel. But her role in the story is functionally that of a sloop, fast, nimble, and capable of outrunning the much larger Black Pearl. The screenplay understood intuitively that speed mattered more than firepower, that a pirate's first and most important tool was the ability to run, to choose the engagement, to close or escape at will. What the franchise got wrong was everything else. The Black Pearl, an enormous supernatural ship of the line, has no historical analogue. Real pirate flagships were captured merchantmen or small frigates, not purpose-built warships. No pirate in history had the resources, the dockyard facilities, or the crew to operate a ship of the line. The idea is pure fantasy. But the Interceptor, she is closer to the truth than any other ship in the franchise. Strip away the Hollywood gloss, step her rig down to a single mast, reduce her crew from 100 to 15, and you have something very close to a Bermuda sloop of 1718. The sloop disappeared the same way she appeared, quietly. By the 1730s, the Golden Age was over. The Navy had hanged the last of the major pirate captains. Nassau had been reclaimed. The trade routes were patrolled, and the sloops, the hundreds of fast, anonymous, disposable little vessels that had carried the pirates across the Atlantic, rotted on beaches, sank in storms, or were broken up for timber. Almost none survived. There is no museum sloop from the Golden Age. No archaeological wreck positively identified as a pirate sloop has ever been excavated. The wider, the only confirmed pirate shipwreck, was a galley, not a sloop. The Queen Anne's Revenge was a frigate. The sloop, the most important vessel in the history of Atlantic piracy, left almost no physical trace. And perhaps that is fitting. The sloop was never meant to be remembered. She was meant to be fast and cheap and expendable. She was meant to close the distance, take the prize, and vanish into the shallows before anyone could follow. She was meant to be a ghost. And she is. The next time you watch a pirate film and see a towering black galleon with 3 banks of guns and a crew of hundreds, remember this: the real ship of piracy was 40 feet long. She had 1 mast. She drew 5 feet of water. She carried 6 guns and 70 men who slept on the open deck. And she was faster than anything you could send after her. That was the sloop, and she changed the world.